Here is a map of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. It was already an old city by then. No one knows when it was first built, but today it is well over 3,000 years old and is a place of pilgrimage for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. About 1,000 years before Jesus was born, King David took the city from the Jebusite people and made it his own. It was there that his son, King Solomon, built the first temple. The temple was burned by the Babylonians. They took many people who lived in Jerusalem into exile. When they returned, the temple was rebuilt. It was rebuilt again and expanded by King Herod by the time Jesus was born. Here are the walls of the city.
We are going to put these walls on our map.
Here is the temple. It was here where the upper room was, as much as anyone can tell after so many centuries. Here is the Roman fortress of Antonia. Here is the palace of the high priest Caiaphas. Here is Herod's palace. The Kidron Valley ran along the east side of the city. This is where the Garden of Gethsemane was and still is today. Here is Golgotha, the place of the skull, where Jesus died on the cross for us. Jesus went to Jerusalem many times, even as a baby and as a boy. Once the Mother Mary and Father Joseph found him in the temple area, talking to the priests. This story is about the last time Jesus went to Jerusalem. We remember it every year during the time called Holy Week. Jesus and the 12 came from Galilee along the twisting Jordan River to Jericho. He healed the blind Bartimaeus and had supper there with Zacchaeus. When they left Jericho, they crossed the low desert and began to climb up towards the city. On Sunday, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples ahead to borrow a donkey. He rode the donkey into the city, probably through a southern gate, and made his way along the pilgrim's route through the oldest part of the city up up towards the Temple Mount. Some people noticed this. They thought he might be the Messiah, so they cut branches and waved them. They threw their coats on the ground and shouted, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who came in the name of the Lord." Others were opening their shops. Fruit, cheese, wine, and bread were being set out on rough tables to sell. Jesus and the 12 climbed up the limestone slabs that made a street of steps until they came to an open area. They must have left the donkey there and decided to enter the temple to pray. They could not go into the triple gate, which was just for the priests. They used one of the other gates. When they reached the Temple Mount, they came out onto the broad open courtyard and crossed it to enter the temple to pray. When their prayers were finished, they left the Temple Mount and went outside the city wall, across the Kidron Valley, to the Mount of Olives to spend the night. On Monday, Jesus probably went again to the Temple Mount and began to teach. That evening, they went back to the Mount of Olives to sleep. On Tuesday, they returned to the Temple Mount and into the long royal portico where the Sanhedrin met at the far end. The money changers and merchants were there. Jesus became angry about all this buying and selling in such a holy place. He turned over the tables for money changing and upset those selling birds in little cages and other animals for sacrifices. He called for the people to keep the temple a place of prayer. The guards began to watch him carefully. They noticed how the crowds listening to him were growing. Jesus and the 12 returned that evening to the Mount of Olives. The people watched them cross the Kidron Valley again and began to talk about the legend that the Mount of Olives was where the Messiah was to come down from heaven and lead an army of angels to drive away the Roman soldiers. On Wednesday, when Jesus returned again to Jerusalem, the crowds listening to him grew larger and the guards became more worried. They began to think of how to arrest him. That evening, Jesus and the 12 crossed over to the Mount of Olives once more. Jesus sat on the hillside across from the temple with Peter and Andrew, James and John. They asked him privately what was going to happen. On Thursday, the guards were ready to take Jesus, but he did not appear on the Temple Mount. The disciples asked Jesus where they would keep the Passover. He told them they would go into the city and look for a man carrying a water jar. He would show them. They climbed up the stairs to an upper room and had their Last Supper together. After they had everything they wanted to eat, Jesus shared the bread and wine with them and said he would always be with them, especially in the bread and wine. They did not understand what he meant, but they would not forget. He also told them to love one another, and he showed them how to care for each other by washing their feet. After that, Judas hurried away into the darkness of the city. The rest went back to the Mount of Olives. It was now late. You could barely see the lights of Jerusalem across the way. Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray while the disciples fell asleep. When Jesus came back from his prayers, the soldiers from the temple came out of the darkness and took him away. Judas was with them and showed Jesus to them. They took him back into the city and finally to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. There the priests asked Jesus questions, but he did not answer. Finally, the high priest tore his robes and cried out, "Blasphemy!" They convicted Jesus of the crime of pretending to be God. After that, the temple guards probably took Jesus to a jail in the Roman fortress of Antonia. On Friday morning, Jesus was brought to Pilate, the Roman governor. Pilate asked Jesus questions. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "You have said so," but had nothing else to say. When Jesus would not answer, Pilate sent him to Herod, the son of Herod the Great, who built the temple and had died about 34 years before. Herod grew tired of him and sent him back to Pilate at the fortress of Antonia. Pilate then showed Jesus to the crowd. There was a tradition to release a prisoner at the time of Passover. Pilate asked the crowd if he should release Jesus or Barabbas. They shouted, "Barabbas." The soldiers prepared Jesus to be crucified. They then took him through the streets to Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, where they hung him on a cross, and he died. People still walk along these streets to remember Jesus and pray. Today they move from a school, where the Roman fortress used to be, along the Via Dolorosa, the street of sadness, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. After Jesus died, the disciples took him down from the cross and placed him in a tomb nearby, given by Joseph of Arimathea. A great stone was rolled in front of the opening to close it like a locked door. On Saturday, everything was quiet. On Sunday, the women had the courage to go to the tomb just to be close to Jesus. When they got there, they found the stone had been rolled away and discovered that somehow he was still with them, as he is with us today.